Welcome to the Inclusionism, Finally podcast. We're back with another deep dive, and today we're tackling Chapter 16, titled A Raw, Authentic Conversation on Innovation and Growth.
Yeah, and right away, that title signals something different, doesn't it? This isn't your standard chapter format.
Not at all. It's presented as a real, unscripted conversation.
Exactly. Between the author, who's referred to as you in the text, and an AI collaborator, GT Sage.
Okay, interesting setup.
Yeah.
So what's the core idea they're getting at? The chapter mentions this metaphor, baking a bigger pie.
That's the central theme. It's really asking, how do we generate growth that's truly sustainable and, maybe more importantly, inclusive? How do we expand the total amount of wealth and opportunity?
Instead of just, fighting over the same limited pie.
Precisely. And it digs into how innovation doesn't just fuel that growth, but actually changes how we think about value itself.
And the fascinating part is this conversation became the chapter. They didn't just talk about collaboration.
Right. The dialogue itself, this back and forth between the human author and the AI, demonstrates the point. It shows how that kind of synergy can lead to, well, bigger ideas.
So, for you listening, expect us to unpack some pretty big questions today. We'll touch on some surprising numbers, maybe some humor from the original dialogue, and really explore how human creativity and AI analysis can mesh.
Yeah. As the chapter puts it, welcome to the pie, freshly baked and still warm. Let's slice it up together.
All right, let's get into it. The conversation kicks off with a huge, almost audacious question.
It really does. It asks, what's the most accurate way to figure out the value of, well, everything in the world, assuming that's even possible?
Wow. Okay, where do you even start with that?
Well, the AI, GT Sage, steps in pretty quickly to provide some structure. It approaches this massive theoretical idea using economic principles, breaking it down.
So step one.
Step one is just defining everything. What are we actually trying to value? And the chapter breaks it down into categories. First, you've got tangible assets.
Right, the physical stuff. Buildings, roads, cars, machinery.
Exactly. Real estate, infrastructure, vehicles, even your furniture. Then intangible assets.
Things you can't touch but still have value, like intellectual property.
Spot on. IP, patents, software code, brand reputation, databases, even human capital, the collective skills and knowledge of the workforce.
Okay.
Natural capital. Hugely important, often undervalued. This is ecosystems, biodiversity, clean air, water, forests, minerals, the planet's resources.
The foundation for everything else, really.
Absolutely. And then financial assets, stocks, bonds, derivatives, bank deposits, all those claims on value.
And I guess you have to subtract debts.
You got it. Liabilities need to be subtracted to get a net value. Just getting your arms around what to include is a massive task in itself.
No kidding. So once you've somehow defined everything, how do you put a number on it? What's step two?
Step two is figuring out the valuation methodologies. How do you assign value? The chapter lists several approaches.
Okay.
Well, there's market value for things traded often, like stocks or houses. There's replacement costs. What would it cost to rebuild that bridge or factory today?
Makes sense. What about harder to value things?
That's where it gets tricky. They mentioned discounted cash flow, estimating future income an asset might generate, and calculating its present value.
Okay.
And things like hedonic pricing models, where economists try to tease out the value of non-market things like clean air by seeing how they affect market prices, say, of nearby homes.
Right, I've heard of that. Like a house near a park costs more.
Exactly. Or willingness to pay surveys, basically asking people how much they'd pay for something, though that's obviously subjective.
So lots of different ways. And the AI points out that value isn't just one thing, right? It depends on context, market, intrinsic, utility.
Precisely. And the conversation acknowledges the huge practical hurdles in the other steps too, like collecting and aggregating data on a global scale. Almost impossible for some categories.
How do you value all the software in the world?
Right. Then you need to factor in depreciation and depletion assets wear out, resources get used up.
And avoiding double counting. Like that forest example.
Yeah, that's the externalities and overlaps problem. A forest provides timber, absorbs carbon, offers recreation. Valuing each aspect without counting the underlying asset multiple times is complex.
And the human side of the conversation flags the big conceptual issues, right?
Yeah.
The AI acknowledges them too.
Oh, definitely. Data availability is a massive constraint. Subjectivity is inherent when you try to value cultural heritage or, happiness.
And value changes constantly.
That's the dynamic nature aspect. Markets shift, tech evolves, geopolitics change the game. Plus, the fundamental ethical considerations does putting a dollar figure on, say, a sacred site or species oversimplify or even harm our relationship with it.
It's a minefield.
Hmm.
But did they actually try to estimate a number despite all that?
They did offer some very approximate figures based on existing economic studies. For global tangible and financial assets, the estimate mentioned is somewhere in the ballpark of $500 to $600 trillion.
Okay, that's a lot. What about natural capital?
Much harder to pin down, as you'd expect. Based on studies trying to value ecosystem services, the rough estimate is maybe $125 to $140 trillion.
Still huge, but yeah, harder to measure.
And intangible assets and liabilities are so varied and complex, the estimates fluctuate wildly. So I think the first big takeaway is just the sheer scale and complexity and how much value lies beyond simple market transactions.
Okay, so we have these massive asset figures. Now, here's something that often trips people up, and the conversation addresses it directly. Why don't those figures, the 500, 600 trillion, include cumulative GDP over the years? Isn't GDP part of the economy's value?
Ah, yes. A really crucial clarification. The chapter makes a very clear distinction here. Assets, that 500, 600 trillion figure, represent a stock of wealth.
A snapshot in time.
Exactly. It's the accumulated wealth held globally at a specific point. Think of it as the total value of everything owned or held right now.
Okay, and GDP.
GDP measures the flow of economic activity. It's the value of goods and services produced within a specific period, usually a year.
So production versus accumulation.
Precisely. And you absolutely cannot add cumulative historical GDP to the current asset stock because that would be massive double counting.
Oh, so?
Because GDP is the engine that helps create assets over time. Economic activity generates income, which is then invested in building factories, developing software, buying equipment, creating those tangible and intangible assets. You measure the resulting asset, the accumulated wealth, not the flow of production that built it, plus the asset itself.
Got it. So GDP contributes to asset growth, but it isn't the same thing as the total stock of assets.
Exactly. The chapter gives examples like the U.S. GDP in 2023 being around $25 trillion. That's the output that year. But total U.S. wealth, the asset stock, is estimated over $140 trillion. Same globally yearly GDP versus the 500, 600 trillion asset base.
Okay, that distinction is clear now. Stock versus flow. Assets are the snapshot of wealth. GDP is the yearly economic activity.
Understanding that is key to the rest of the conversation about growth.
Right. So knowing what this stock of global tangible and financial assets, GTFA, represents, the conversation then asks the AI to trace how it's grown, specifically since 1945.
Yeah, and the AI sketches out this history, showing a really substantial upward trend overall. It's been a dramatic increase since World War II.
Driven by what mainly?
A combination of things. Major economic policies globally, huge technological advancements, the rise of globalization, and really significant financial innovation, especially in recent decades.
The chapter breaks it down into periods, doesn't it? What was the first one?
The post-WWII era, roughly 1945 to 1970, focus was on reconstruction, recovery. Financial markets were, relatively less developed globally compared to now.
Then things started to shift.
Right. The 1970s, the Bretton Woods system and early globalization period. You had the collapse of Bretton Woods, leading to floating exchange rates, more volatility. And the oil crises had a big impact on tangible asset values.
Okay, then the 80s and 90s.
That period, 1980 to 2000, is described as financial deregulation and market expansion. Lots of market liberalization, plus technological leaps, think personal computers, early internet boosting both tangible and financial assets. Stock markets boomed.
And the 2000s.
Globalization and financial innovation, 2000 to 2020, saw rapid growth in emerging markets joining the global economy, development of really complex financial products, massive cross-border capital flows. The financial asset base just ballooned.
Leading up to now, what are the recent trends?
From 2020 onwards, the chapter highlights a continued, even accelerated shift towards valuing intangible assets, IP, data. Digital platforms are huge now. Financial assets kept growing rapidly, and interestingly, central bank balance sheets became enormous, making them major asset holders themselves.
So looking across that whole sweep, from 45 to now, what kind of growth rate are we talking about for these global, tangible, and financial assets?
The chapter gives an estimate for the average annual percentage increase over that entire period, 1945 to 2023. It's approximately 9.29%.
9.29%. Average annual growth for nearly 80 years. That sounds huge.
It is a staggering rate of accumulation, yeah.
Which naturally leads to the next big question in the conversation. Is that sustainable? Can global assets realistically keep growing at over 9% a year?
Exactly. And the AI's answer here is, well, pretty cautious and grounded. It says sustainability hinges on a bunch of interconnected factors, and frankly, many look like headwinds.
Such as?
Well, the classic drivers: economic growth and productivity, historically fueled by tech and globalization, as we said. But the chapter raises the question of diminishing returns, especially in already developed economies. That could inherently slow things down.
And resource limits, I assume.
That's a massive one. Resource constraints. We live on a finite planet. Key resources are limited, and environmental damage, climate change, biodiversity loss puts fundamental brakes on traditional expansion. It points squarely at the need for a shift to sustainable, maybe even circular economies. Population dynamics. Many developed countries have aging populations, slowing growth rates. That affects consumption, labor supply, investment patterns.
Debt.
Global debt levels, yes. A lot of financial asset growth has been fueled by credit expansion. That carries risks of instability, potential crises that could halt or reverse asset growth.
But innovation could help?
Technological innovation is the wild card, definitely. It can drive new growth waves, potentially offsetting some limits, but it has to keep pace with the mounting challenges.
And global stability matters too, right?
Absolutely. Geopolitical stability, conflicts, trade disputes, political uncertainty, they all disrupt markets and put a damper on growth.
So that 9.29% figure, how does it compare to, say, actual economic growth?
Good point. The chapter contrasts it with real global economic growth adjusted for inflation, which has historically averaged more like 3 to 5% annually. That 9.29% nominal asset growth rate likely includes a hefty chunk of inflation over those decades, plus those big post-war and globalization expansion cycles.
Okay, so what's the bottom line from the chapter? How long can this near 9% growth last?
It's nuanced. The conclusion is, under ideal conditions, continued strong innovation. Stability, maybe it could last another 20, 30 years. However,
What's the but?
there's a but. It concludes it's more likely limited to maybe the next 10, 15 years at that kind of rapid pace. The reasoning is that resource and demographic pressures are really expected to bite harder soon.
So the pace probably has to slow down unless we fundamentally change things.
That seems to be the implication. Policies tackling those big challenges, climate, resources, demographics, could potentially slow the decline in the growth rate, but maintaining close to 9% looks very, very challenging long term.
Okay, so the historical boom in asset values isn't necessarily a permanent fixture. But then the conversation pivots in a really interesting way. It introduces this idea that maybe it's not just about physical or economic limits, but about our perception of value.
Exactly. This is where it gets quite philosophical almost. The idea that how we perceive value changes dramatically over time, and this shift in perception is actually a major driver of the apparent growth in global assets.
How does that work? Give me an example.
Well, the most obvious one is inflation and nominal growth, which we touched on. Inflation makes the dollar value of assets go up, even if the asset itself hasn't changed. The chapter uses the classic $100 K house from 1970 now being worth $1 million.
Right. The house didn't physically grow 10 times bigger.
Exactly. A lot of that increase is inflation plus increased demand meeting limited supply, changing the perceived market value drastically.
Okay, what else changes perception?
Big cultural and technological shifts. Think about it 100 years ago. Things like whale oil or certain furs were incredibly valuable. Now, not so much. Meanwhile, data, digital assets, AI algorithms, things that barely existed are perceived as immensely valuable.
So society collectively decides what's valuable, and that changes.
Constantly. Fossil fuels were king. Now renewable energy tech and carbon credits are gaining perceived value. This dynamism, our ability to shift focus and create new things we deem valuable, is key.
Scarcity plays a role too, right?
Definitely. Scarcity and utility. Clean water becomes scarcer. Its value perception goes up. A new technology emerges, creating a value boom in related industries or locations.
The chapter makes a distinction here, doesn't it, between relative and absolute value.
Yes, a really interesting point. Relative value is how we measure and perceive value within our current economic system. That 500, 600 trillion GTFA figure largely reflects this relative value. Like a smartphone, the parts might cost $100, but its perceived value is $1,000 because of its function, brand, ecosystem.
An absolute value.
That's arguably tied more to the physical reality, the finite limits of tangible resources like minerals or land. But, and this is the crucial argument, human innovation applies perceived value to new creations, things often not directly limited by physical scarcity, like software or ideas.
Meaning perceived value could, in theory, grow indefinitely.
That's the implication explored. If value is largely perceptual and dynamic, maybe the growth of perceived wealth, like GTFA, isn't as strictly bound by physical limits as we might think.
So what does this mean for sustainability?
It suggests GTFA growth might be more sustainable than if it were purely tied to finite physical stuff. How? Innovation keeps creating entirely new types of assets. Think AI, gene editing tech, metaverse concepts that don't necessarily deplete existing resources in the same way.
Economic systems themselves generate perceived value too, right?
Yeah.
Through things like leverage.
Right, leverage, network effects, and digital platforms. And just basic human psychology, our desires and perceptions shift, creating new demands and markets, fueling perceived value growth.
But there have to be limits to that idea too. The chapter acknowledges challenges.
Oh, for sure. It's not a free lunch. Physical reality still bites. Degrading the environment makes everything less sustainable regardless of perception. Tangible resources are finite and essential.
And inequality.
Huge point. If this perceived value growth disproportionately benefits a few, it creates social instability, which isn't sustainable.
And the environmental damage.
Makes the whole perceived value structure built on top of it precarious. So the conclusion isn't that perception replaces reality, but that it's a powerful, dynamic driver of the asset growth we measure. GTFA reflects our adaptive perception of value as much as, or maybe even more than, fixed physical wealth.
That's quite a mind-bending way to think about economic growth.
It really reframes it, doesn't it?
And all this leads the conversation towards a pretty strong conclusion, cutting through the complexity.
It does. It lands firmly on innovation. That's the key. The undeniable engine of sustainable growth.
Not just any growth, but sustainable growth.
Yeah.
How does innovation achieve that, according to the chapter?
It details how innovation actually expands the pie. First, by creating entirely new slices.
Like new industries.
Exactly. Think of the internet, mobile communications, renewable energy, biotech, AI, blockchain. These created vast new economic sectors, essentially wealth generated from scratch, adding to the global pie.
Yeah. What else?
Making existing slices more efficient. Innovation unlocks more value from resources we already have. Precision agriculture uses less water and fertilizer. AI optimizes logistics. New materials improve manufacturing.
So getting more from less.
Right. Third, increasing accessibility. Innovation often democratizes access to tools and opportunities. Cheaper communication, online education, mobile banking platforms, they allow more people globally to participate, learn, contribute, and benefit.
Expanding who gets to bake the pie, essentially.
Well put. And fourth, building resilience. Innovation is crucial for tackling systemic challenges that threaten growth, like climate change, developing renewables, carbon capture, resource scarcity, new materials, recycling tech, or pandemics, vaccines, diagnostics.
So innovation isn't just about cool new stuff. It's fundamental to making growth last and addressing big problems.
Yes. That's the core message. The simplified truth that emerges is pretty stark. If we want sustainable growth, if we want that bigger pie, we must prioritize innovation at every level.
Economically, socially, environmentally.
All three. Economic, fostering R&D, entrepreneurship, social, innovating for better quality of life, health, equity, environmental. Relentless focus on sustainable practices, clean tech, regeneration.
And the chapter ends this section with a kind of call to action.
Yeah, practical ideas on how to prioritize it. It starts with education, teaching creativity, critical thinking, not just rote learning. Governments need to fund research, support startups.
Businesses need to foster experimentation.
Exactly, not just optimize yesterday's models. And communities need to celebrate innovators, support risk takers who are trying to build something new.
Which brings the conversation right back to the beginning, doesn't it? Back to the growing pie metaphor.
It does, full circle. Triggered by that thought that real growth shouldn't mean someone else gets less, that your slice getting bigger shouldn't shrink another's.
It contrasts that with the old way of thinking.
Right, the old thinking, zero sum. The economy is a fixed pie, so for me to get more, you have to get less. Politics and business become about grabbing the biggest slice.
Versus the new thinking.
Positive sum, the growing pie mentality. The goal is to align incentives, collaborate, innovate, so the entire pie gets bigger. Wealth isn't fixed. We can create more value where none existed.
So it's not about dividing scarcity, but creating abundance.
That's the ideal, yes. Baking a bigger, better pie together, leading to more and potentially larger slices for everyone involved in creating that new value.
And finally, the chapter itself reflects on why this format, this raw conversation, works as a chapter in the book.
Yeah, it touches on a few points. One is clarity of vision. The back and forth really sharpens that contrast between the zero-sum trap and the bigger pie potential.
It highlights the key themes well.
Definitely. Innovation, redefining value, expanding the pie, they emerge naturally from the dialogue. And the engagement factor being conversational makes these complex ideas feel more accessible, maybe more relatable than a dense essay might.
And it connects to the broader theme of the book series.
Right. It builds momentum for inclusionism by linking innovation and value creation directly to inclusion, showing how making the pie bigger can benefit many, not just a select few.
Plus, the format itself is innovative.
Exactly. Presenting an AI-human dialogue as a chapter kind of embodies the collaborative innovation it's talking about.
So, wrapping up our deep dive into this chapter, the core message seems incredibly powerful. Innovation isn't just a nice-to-have or a tech industry buzzword.
No, it's framed as the absolute lifeblood of sustainable growth. The engine that creates new value, tackles challenges, and offers a path towards, hopefully, a more prosperous and inclusive future.
It boils down to that simple, stark phrase from the conversation.
Innovate or stagnate. The choice seems clear, even if the path is incredibly challenging.
And it leaves us, and you listening, with a really provocative thought to chew on. If our perception of value is such a critical driver of the measured growth in global assets, how much of the value we see quantified all around us in stock prices, company valuations, complex financial instruments is ultimately based not on concrete, inherent worth, but on shared beliefs, dynamic consensus, and maybe even collective imagination?
And if that's true, what does it really imply about the future stability or fragility of our economic systems? And perhaps more personally, thinking about that growing pie mentality. Where in your own life, your work, your community, are you contributing to creating value that didn't exist before? How are you helping to bake a bigger pie?